"Mother, the investors are here. Please, use the staff entrance in the back." The words were not a request. They were a command, delivered in a low hiss, a serpent's whisper meant only for me. My son, David, stood before me, his custom-tailored suit straining slightly at the shoulders. He looked like a stranger wearing his face. His smile was a thin, white line drawn across his lips, as tight and painful as the knot forming in my stomach. He pressed something into my hand. It was cold, wrapped in cheap, crinkling plastic. A roast beef sandwich, the kind you get from a vending machine at a bus station. "Don't embarrass us," he added, his eyes flicking over my simple but clean dress, the one I'd saved for this very night. The grand opening of Elysian Bites, his upscale Austin eatery. Our dream. His father's dream. Now, apparently, it was just his. I didn't say anything. My throat had closed up, a fist of ice lodging itself where words should have been. I could only watch as he turned, his posture instantly transforming. He straightened his back, the tense line of his shoulders relaxing into an easy, confident grace. He and his wife, Chloe, glided towards a man I recognized as a city councilman. Their laughter was light and airy, a sound that didn't belong to the son I had just seen. Chloe, draped in a silk dress the color of a summer sky, touched the councilman's arm. Her diamond bracelet caught the light from the massive, cascading chandelier, sending shards of brilliance dancing across the room. They looked like a magazine cover, perfect, polished, a world away from the woman holding a sad, plastic-wrapped sandwich. My feet, of their own accord, began to move towards the back of the restaurant. I walked past tables draped in pristine white linen, set with polished silver that gleamed under the soft, expensive lighting. I saw the faces of Austin's elite, bankers, tech entrepreneurs, real estate moguls, all of them smiling, sipping champagne, their voices a low, contented murmur. They were celebrating the birth of a new culinary star. They were celebrating my son. The air was thick with the scent of money, perfume, and the complex, beautiful aroma of the food being prepared in the kitchen. Richard's food. The very first dish they were serving, the seared scallops with a saffron foam, was a recipe he and I had perfected on a rainy Tuesday in our own small kitchen, laughing as we argued over a pinch more salt. The memory was a physical blow, knocking the air from my lungs. For a moment, I saw him standing there next to David, a proud hand on his son's shoulder, his chef's whites stained with love and hard work. But the image flickered and died, leaving only the cold reality of my son's back as he schmoozed with strangers. A busboy, a young kid with frightened eyes, scurried past me, his tray laden with empty champagne flutes. He didn't even see me. I was already a ghost. As I neared the swinging doors to the kitchen, David's voice, now amplified for his audience, drifted back to me. "It's a vision I've had for years," he was saying, his tone rich with false modesty, "to create something truly new, something that honors the past, but isn't bound by it." Honors the past. The hypocrisy of it was so vast, so profound, it didn't even feel like anger. It was a hollow, echoing emptiness. The swinging doors pushed open, and the calm murmur of the dining room was replaced by the cacophony of the kitchen. The clang of pans, the hiss of the grill, the sharp staccato shouts of the sous chef. This was a world I knew, a world I had lived in, breathed in, alongside Richard for 40 years. But this kitchen felt different. It was sterile, efficient, all stainless steel and cold, fluorescent light. There was no warmth here, no soul. David had followed me, his presence a dark cloud at my back. He didn't speak. He just placed a firm hand on my shoulder blade and steered me past the prep stations, past the dishwashing pit where steam billowed like a vision of hell. He guided me towards a heavy metal door at the far end of the kitchen, the staff entrance. He opened it, and a gust of humid night air, thick with the stench of garbage, rushed in to greet me. The alley was dark, illuminated only by the flickering purple neon sign of the bar next door. A mountain of black trash bags slumped against a graffiti-covered brick wall, next to an overflowing dumpster. This was my grand entrance, my place at the celebration. "I'll have someone let you know when it's safe to come back in," David said. He still wasn't looking at me. His gaze was fixed on the dining room, on his glorious future. He was already gone. The heavy door clicked shut, leaving me in the sudden, shocking silence of the alley. The sounds of the party were muffled now, a distant heartbeat behind the steel door. My hand, I realized, was still clutching the sandwich. I looked down at it. The bread was already starting to look damp and gray under the plastic. Through the clear wrapper, I could see a single sad slice of processed roast beef, pale and unappetizing. A meal for a stray, a handout for a beggar. I thought of the $500,000, my entire life savings, the entirety of Richard's life insurance policy. Every penny I had in the world poured into this restaurant. A gift he had called my investment when he'd had the papers drawn up. A gift to secure his future. I had signed them without a second thought, my heart swelling with a mother's pride. I was living in his guest room now, a small, windowless space at the back of the sprawling house my money had helped buy. I was a fixture he and Chloe had learned to walk around, a piece of old furniture that no longer fit the decor. My fingers tightened around the sandwich, the plastic crinkling in protest. I remembered a different night, 20 years ago. David was a teenager, failing chemistry. He'd come home, dejected, convinced he was a failure. Richard had sat him down at our kitchen table, not with a lecture, but with a bowl of his signature beef stew, a recipe that had taken him years to perfect. "The secret, son," Richard had told him, his voice warm and gentle, "isn't just in the ingredients. It's in the time, the patience, the love you put into it. You can't rush greatness." David had eaten the stew, and we had talked for hours. He promised he would make us proud. He promised he would carry on his father's legacy. Standing in the reeking alley, I could smell that stew, a phantom scent overlaying the stink of rot and decay, the love, the patience, the time. David had taken the ingredients, but he had discarded the secret. He was rushing greatness, and he was trampling over his own past to get there. A cockroach skittered across the grimy concrete near my foot. I didn't flinch. I felt a strange kinship with it. We were both creatures of the dark, unwanted, living in the shadows of someone else's feast. From inside, I heard a burst of applause, followed by the muffled sound of my son's voice, likely giving a speech. He would be thanking his investors. He would be thanking his brilliant wife. He would be taking a bow. He would not be thanking the man whose recipes were making him famous. He would not be thanking the woman he had just exiled to a garbage-strewn alley. My gaze fell upon the dumpster again. It was overflowing with the day's refuse, cardboard boxes, vegetable peelings, empty wine bottles, the debris of creation. I slowly unclenched my fingers and let the plastic-wrapped sandwich drop from my hand. It landed on the filthy concrete with a soft, pathetic thud. It looked at home there. I leaned back against the cold, rough brick wall, the material scratching against the thin fabric of my dress. I closed my eyes, but the image of David's face was seared onto the inside of my eyelids. That tight, false smile, the coldness in his eyes. The son I knew, the boy who loved his father's stew, was gone. In his place was a man who would feed his own mother a garbage sandwich and hide her in an alley to protect his image. The chill of the brick began to seep into my bones, a deep, invasive cold that had nothing to do with the night air. It was the chill of a betrayal so absolute it felt like the end of the world. The party music thumped on, a drumbeat for a life I was no longer a part of. And in the darkness, surrounded by the ghosts of my husband's dreams and the stench of my son's success, I stood perfectly still and felt nothing at all. My name is Anna. I am 68 years old, and for the first time in my life, I am a ghost. The walls of this room are a sterile, unforgiving white. There is no window. The only air I breathe is recycled, humming faintly through a vent in the ceiling, carrying the distant, muffled sounds of a life I am no longer a part of. The laughter from the living room, the clinking of wine glasses, the heavy, confident footsteps of my son, David. These sounds don't reach me. They pass over me, through me, as if I am already just a memory. It wasn't always like this. My life for 45 years was a symphony of sensory joys, conducted by my husband, Richard. He was a chef, but that word is too small for him. He was a poet whose medium was food. Our little bistro, the Sterling Plate, was never famous, never grand, but it was honest. It was a place where every dish told a story, our story. I was his partner in every sense of the word, his palate, his confidant, the keeper of his secrets. When he passed, the music of my life stopped. The silence was deafening, a void so vast I thought it would swallow me whole. Then David came to me, his eyes wide with ambition. He had a dream, he said, a restaurant that would redefine fine dining, Elysian Bites. He called it a tribute to his father, a way to carry the torch. I saw Richard's fire in his eyes, or perhaps I only wanted to. I was adrift, and he offered me a shore. He spoke of legacy, of honoring his father's name, and I, a grieving widow, desperate to keep my husband's spirit alive, believed him. I gave him everything. Richard's life insurance, a sum meant to be my security blanket for the rest of my days. My entire life savings, scraped together from decades of careful living, over $500,000. I signed the papers in his lawyer's sleek, impersonal office, my hand trembling slightly. David squeezed my arm, his smile brilliant. "This is for us, Mom," he promised. "This is for Dad's legacy." I believed I was investing in a dream. I was, in fact, purchasing my own invisibility. Now my world has shrunk to the size of this guest room. My clothes are folded in a single drawer of a cheap dresser. My presence is an inconvenience, a quiet, gray smudge on the polished perfection of David and Chloe's life. I am a ghost, haunting the hallways of a home I paid for, a silent witness to a life built on my sacrifice. But they have a secret they don't know, and I have one that I guard with my life. In this small, airless room, with a burner phone and a heavily encrypted laptop, I become someone else. The world doesn't know Anna Sterling, the quiet widow, but the culinary world trembles before a Veritas plate. I am the most influential and most feared anonymous food critic on the internet. My Substack has over 100,000 paid subscribers. My Instagram posts can sell out a restaurant for months or shutter it in a week. They think Veritas is a man, probably a jaded Michelin-starred chef who retired to spill the industry's secrets. They imagine him, cynical and brilliant, dining under a cloak of anonymity. They have no idea he is a 68-year-old woman in a suburban guest room, typing reviews with fingers that still ache from a lifetime of kneading dough beside the man she loved. My anonymity is my only power, my last remaining piece of armor in a world that has stripped me of everything else. Last night, Chloe left a copy of the Elysian Bites menu on the kitchen island. She'd been showing it to a friend, bragging about David's genius. I picked it up after they went to bed, the house finally still. The paper was thick, expensive, the font elegant. And as I read the descriptions, a cold dread, heavy and slow, began to seep into my bones. David calls his menu modernist fusion. A more accurate term would be plagiarism. My eyes scanned the page, and the ghosts of my past rose up to meet me. Bœuf bourguignon with a deconstructed burgundy essence. My breath caught in my throat. I was transported back 30 years to a Sunday afternoon in our small bistro kitchen. The air was thick with the scent of thyme and bay leaf. Richard was standing over the heavy cast-iron pot, his brow furrowed in concentration. "You see, Anna," he had said, his voice a low, gentle rumble. "The wine must whisper, not shout. It's a conversation with the beef, not an argument." He'd spent a month perfecting that whisper, a technique of reducing the wine with shallots and a sprig of rosemary until it was a syrup, a pure, unadulterated soul of the grape. A single drop held the entire story of the vineyard. It was his signature, his secret. Now on this page, David described it as a gaseous foam, a textural innovation. He had taken his father's poetry and turned it into a cheap, arrogant slogan. I ran my finger down the list, and every item was a new wound. Seared scallops, with a saffron vanilla reduction. I remember the night we created that. We'd received a shipment of saffron from a friend in Spain, threads like spun gold. We stayed up until 2 a.m., experimenting, laughing, our fingers stained yellow. Richard said the vanilla was my idea, that it was the feminine touch that balanced the earthy saffron. It was our dish, not his, not mine. Ours. Then I saw it, at the bottom of the dessert menu. The final, most intimate betrayal. Lavender-infused crème brûlée with a spun sugar crown. That wasn't just a recipe. That was our anniversary. For our 25th, Richard wanted to create something that tasted like our love felt. We spent a week in Provence, walking through lavender fields, and he was obsessed with capturing that scent, that feeling of peace and sun-warmed earth. It took us 2 months of trial and error back home. Too much lavender, and it tasted like soap. Too little, and it was lost. We finally found the perfect balance, infusing the cream with the blossoms for exactly 12 hours. I was the one who suggested the spun sugar crown, a delicate, glittering nest to hold a single, candied blossom. "It looks like a halo," he had said, kissing me. "For my angel." I was never just the chef's wife, a smiling hostess at the front of the house. I was the co-architect of every flavor, the secret ingredient in every dish. Richard's hands did the work, but his heart and my palate created the magic. It was a legacy of 2 people, woven together by love and mutual respect. A legacy my son, my own flesh and blood, was now serving to the world as his singular, brilliant creation. He hadn't just taken the recipes, he had stolen our life. He had stolen the story of our love and was passing it off as his own. I sank into a kitchen chair, the expensive menu trembling in my hand, the ghost in the house suddenly feeling the cold, hard weight of a purpose. The grief that had hollowed me out for years was slowly, terrifyingly, beginning to feel like rage. The days that followed the grand opening bled into one another, a watercolor wash of gray humiliations. My life, once vibrant and filled with the aromas of a shared kitchen and the warmth of a loving partnership, had shrunk to the 4 windowless walls of the guest room and the silent corridors of my son's house. I was a ghost at their feast, an inconvenient specter they tried their best to ignore. The ritual of dinner became a masterclass in passive cruelty. I was never invited to the dining table. While David, Chloe, and their young son Lucas sat in the formal dining room under the warm glow of a crystal chandelier, my meal would be left for me on the granite countertop in the kitchen. It was always the last plate served, often tepid, the sauces congealed. The plates themselves were a message. They ate from fine, bone-white porcelain, a wedding gift I had given them. My food was served on a chipped ceramic plate, a relic from a cheap set they'd bought in college. It had a hairline crack running from the rim to the center, a tiny, dark fissure that seemed to grow a little wider each day, mirroring the fracture in my own heart. I'd eat standing at the counter, or sometimes I'd take the plate to my room, the silence of my small space preferable to the sounds of their family life drifting from the other room. The clinking of their silverware, the murmur of their conversation, Chloe's high, bright laughter. Sometimes I'd hear her teaching Lucas his manners, and the words were like tiny, sharp pebbles thrown at me. "Lucas, honey, we sit up straight at the table. We don't want to look like we have no manners, do we? We use our forks and knives properly. It's important to show respect." Each word was a subtle indictment of my own solitary, undignified meal at the kitchen counter. One evening, my plate was a plastic one, the kind you use for picnics. Chloe didn't even look at me as she set it down. "The dishwasher is full of the good plates," she said, her voice clipped, "and I don't want you to drop another one." She was referring to an incident weeks ago when my trembling hands, slick from washing a mountain of their dishes, had lost their grip on a saucer. The sound of it shattering on the tile had brought David running, his face a mask of fury, not for my startled cry, but for the broken dish. "For God's sake, Mom, be careful." "Do you know how much these cost?" He never asked if I was hurt. The tiny cut on my finger had bled for 10 minutes, but the wound in my spirit bled for days. My laundry was always the last load. Chloe would meticulously wash and fold their clothes, separating whites and colors, using fragrant softeners that left their garments smelling of lavender and sunshine. My small pile of worn cardigans and simple blouses would sit in the hamper for days, until she finally, grudgingly, tossed them into the machine on a quick, cold cycle, often with a dismissive sigh. They came out clean, but never soft, never smelling of anything but utility. I was an afterthought, a chore to be completed with minimum effort. The exclusion became more blatant. They started taking weekend trips, to the coast, to a vineyard upstate. I was never invited. I would only find out when the house fell silent on a Saturday morning, a note left on the counter. Gone for the weekend. There's leftover lasagna in the fridge. Then, a day or two later, the digital daggers would appear. Chloe would post a gallery of photos on her Facebook page. David with his arm around her, Lucas making a sandcastle, the three of them smiling into the sun. The captions were always a special kind of poison. "Family is everything, she would write, and hundreds of her friends would like the post, leaving comments like, "Perfect family," and "You guys are goals." I would scroll through the images on my small secondhand phone, my thumb tracing their happy faces on the screen. I wasn't in the picture. I wasn't family. I was the leftover lasagna in the fridge. Even my access to the world was curtailed. The large television in the living room, a space I was tacitly barred from entering when they were home, became a forbidden object. One afternoon, hoping to catch an old movie, I found the remote was missing. I searched everywhere, my heart sinking with each empty cushion I lifted. Later that evening, I heard Chloe telling David, "I hid the remote. She'll just be in here all day making the place look messy." The living room was for them, for their image of a perfect life. My presence, my simple desire for an hour of distraction, was a mess. I became a master of silence, of making myself small. I learned the floorboards that creaked and avoided them. I learned to time my trips to the kitchen for when they were out or occupied. I was an expert in invisibility, but sometimes you can't help but be seen, and that's when the cruelty became most acute. The breaking point, the moment a hairline crack in my resolve began to split wide open, happened on a Tuesday night. David had become a minor celebrity in the local foodie scene and was doing a live stream on Twitch to promote Elysian Bites. He set up in the main kitchen, the one that appeared in magazines, with its gleaming copper pots and professional-grade gas range. He had a bright ring light that made his face look flawless and his teeth impossibly white. I was in the scullery, a small, humid room off the back, tasked with scrubbing the enormous, grease-caked pots from the restaurant's lunch service. My hands were raw, submerged in hot, gray water. I could hear his media-trained voice, smooth and confident, as he answered questions from his followers. The chat was scrolling by on a laptop he had propped up on the counter. Then, a question popped up that made my heart stop. A user named FoodieFan88 asked, "Chef David, your flavor combinations are so unique. What's the inspiration behind your signature dishes? The lavender-infused duck, the sea salt caramel tart. It's genius." I paused, my hands still in the murky water, and listened. This was it. This was a chance, a tiny, fleeting chance for him to give a nod to his father, to the legacy he was building his empire on. A simple, "I learned a lot from my dad. He was a great chef," would have been enough. It would have been a balm on my raw, scraped soul. Instead, David let out a polished, rehearsed laugh. "That's a great question," he said, leaning into the camera with a conspiratorial smile. "You know, it's funny. I get asked that a lot. The truth is, it's from an old, dusty recipe book I found when we were cleaning out the attic a while back. Belonged to some distant relative, I think. A great aunt or something. I just stumbled upon these incredible ideas and decided to modernize them, give them my own twist. Some distant relative." The words hit me with the force of a physical blow. I felt the air leave my lungs. My husband, Richard, the love of my life, the man whose hands had created every single one of those recipes, had been dismissed as some distant relative. My own contribution, the hours we'd spent together, laughing and experimenting, tweaking a pinch of salt here, a sprig of thyme there, had been erased. We were a dusty book in an attic. For a fleeting second, as David gestured grandly with his hand, the camera panned slightly too far to the left. In the background, through the doorway to the scullery, my reflection was visible in the polished chrome of a refrigerator. A hunched figure in a faded apron, hands submerged in a sink, steam rising around me. A ghost. I ducked back instantly, my heart pounding, but the damage was done. I had been a backdrop to his lie. The chat lit up with praise. So humble, a true innovator finding gold in the past. Love that he's honoring his family history. Each comment was another turn of the knife. He wasn't honoring our history. He was desecrating it. He was standing on his father's grave and calling himself tall. I leaned against the cold, damp wall of the scullery, the stench of grease and dish soap filling my nostrils, and I felt a coldness spread through me that had nothing to do with the tile floor. It was the coldness of a profound and bottomless betrayal. The final straw came a few weeks later. The air in the house had grown even thicker with unspoken resentment. I found a copy of Texas Monthly left on the coffee table, a place I rarely dared to venture. On the cover, David was smiling, holding a pristine white plate with a dish I recognized instantly. Richard's signature seared scallops with a saffron risotto. It was the first dish he had ever made for me. The headline read, "Elysian Bites, the new king of Texas cuisine?" My hands trembled as I opened to the article. It was a glowing profile celebrating David's vision and bold creativity. And then I saw the quote. The journalist had asked him about the more traditional restaurants in the city, the ones that had been institutions for decades. David's response was quoted in bold type. "I have immense respect for what came before, of course, but at some point you have to innovate. It's time to move past the old guard, to create something truly new, something that speaks to the now." The old guard, that's what he called his father. Not a source of inspiration, not a foundation to build upon, but an obstacle, a relic. The old guard, to be moved past. He wasn't just stealing Richard's food, he was actively, publicly working to erase his memory, to frame his own plagiarism as a heroic act of progress. He was positioning himself as the bright future and his father as the dusty, forgotten past. I closed the magazine, my fingers leaving dents in the glossy cover. I looked at the picture of my son, his eyes full of ambition, his smile so empty of gratitude. I thought of my husband, of his hands, scarred from 1,000 minor burns, of his laughter, as he perfected the very dish David was now using to claim his crown. I thought of the $500,000, my entire future, Richard's legacy, that I had given him, now being used to fund my own erasure. The grief that had been my constant companion for months began to curdle, changing into something else. It was no longer a soft, aching sadness. It was hardening, sharpening. The despair, the feeling of being trapped and helpless, began to recede, replaced by a cold, clear purpose. The daily humiliations, the chipped plate, the last load laundry, the lie on the live stream, the quote in the magazine. They were no longer individual wounds. They were kindling, and a fire was starting to burn. He wanted to move past the old guard. He wanted to be the new king. He thought his mother was just a ghost in the scullery. He had forgotten who I was. He had forgotten that I was more than just a grieving widow. He had forgotten that before I was his mother, I was his father's partner in everything. And he had certainly forgotten that for the past 5 years, the most feared, respected, and anonymous food critic in the entire state, the one whose review could make or break a restaurant overnight, wrote under a very particular pseudonym. That night, I didn't eat the cold meal left on the counter. I sat in my small, dark room and pulled out a laptop and a burner phone I kept hidden in a shoebox under my bed. The screen illuminated my face in the darkness. My fingers, still aching from scrubbing his pots, flew across the keyboard. He had taken my past. He had taken my future. He was trying to take my husband's name. But he had left me one thing, a voice. My purpose settled over me, not with heat, but with an icy, crystalline calm. Veritas Plate would be making a reservation. And the truth, I vowed, would be the main course. The decision to act was a spark in a cavern of grief, and my first move was a practical one. I had to understand my position, the ground upon which I stood before I could think of building a war machine. That ground was my investment, the $500,000 that represented the sum total of my husband's life and my own security. I needed the agreement. I had signed it in a haze of trust and sorrow, a celebratory dinner where David and Chloe had toasted to family and legacy while sliding a sheaf of papers across the polished table. I remembered David's hand on mine, his smile so warm it could melt permafrost. "It's just a formality, Mom, to make it all official." I didn't have a copy. In the chaotic move from my home into their guest room, so many things had been boxed up, misplaced, or perhaps, I now suspected, purposefully lost. So I had to go to the source. David's lawyer, a man named Marcus Thorne, whose business card was as sleek and cold as his handshake. I found the card in an old wallet and dialed the number, my finger hovering over the keypad. This was the first shot fired, a quiet pop in a war no one else knew had been declared. The phone rang 3 times before a crisp, dismissive voice answered. "Thorne Associates." "I'd like to speak with Marcus Thorne, please. My name is Anna Sterling." The silence on the other end was a form of punctuation. "Regarding?" "It's a personal matter regarding his client, David Sterling." A click, a brief hold, and then his voice, smooth as oil. "Anna, to what do I owe the pleasure?" He sounded amused, like a cat watching a mouse consider leaving its hole. "Marcus," I said, keeping my voice level, "I need a copy of the investment agreement I signed for Elysian Bites, the one for my $500,000 contribution." He made a soft, thoughtful sound. "Ah, yes, the seed capital." Wonderful gesture, that was. Truly the foundation of David's success. I'm sure I have that on file somewhere. Things are a bit hectic post-launch, as you can imagine. Let me see what I can do. I'll have my assistant dig it up and send it over. "When can I expect it?" I asked. "Oh, I wouldn't worry your head about it, Anna. Soon. I'll get it to you soon." The condescension was a coating on every word. He wasn't talking to an investor. He was talking to an old woman he'd been instructed to manage. "I need it this week, Marcus." "We'll do our best," he said, the promise as hollow as a drum. "You take care now." He hung up before I could reply. The week passed, then another. I called his office twice. The first time, his assistant informed me Mr. Thorne was in a deposition. The second time, he was in a meeting with a client. She promised she would pass along the message. The days stretched into a silent, agonizing wait. I'd see David and Chloe sweeping through the house, dressed for success, smelling of expensive perfume and ambition. They'd give me a fleeting plastic smile. "Everything okay, Anna?" Chloe would ask, her eyes already looking past me. "You seem a little tense." "Just tired," I'd murmur, and they would accept it without a second thought. I was a piece of furniture to them, a relic. One does not inquire into the inner life of a grandfather clock. You just wind it up and hope it doesn't stop ticking on your watch. My tension was an invisible storm contained within the four walls of my windowless room. The waiting was a form of psychological torture. It allowed my mind to churn, to imagine the worst. Why the delay? What could possibly be so difficult about emailing a PDF? Each passing day, a small stone of dread was added to the pile in my gut. Finally, 3 weeks after my first call, a long, elegant envelope arrived by courier. It was addressed to me, but it felt like a summons. My hands trembled as I took it. It was heavy, the paper thick and expensive. I sat on the edge of my bed, the mattress sighing under my weight, and slid a finger under the seal. The document inside was pristine. Private capital agreement. I began to read, my eyes scanning the familiar, dense blocks of legalese. It all looked right at first. The names, the date, the name of the restaurant. And then I found it. The section detailing my contribution. My breath caught in my throat. I read the sentence once, then twice, then a third time, praying my aging eyes were deceiving me. The words were precise, surgical. The contract I remembered signing, the one David had called an investment, had been subtly, masterfully altered. A single clause, nested deep within Article 4, Section B, had been rephrased. My $500,000 was not classified as an equity stake, or a loan, or an investment of any kind. It was legally defined in cold black ink as an irrevocable, non-refundable monetary gift. Irrevocable. The word hammered against my skull. Non-refundable. A gift. I felt the air leave my lungs in a silent gasp. The room, already small and confining, seemed to shrink, the walls pressing in on me. The paper in my hands felt less like a contract and more like the deed to my own cage. I had no claim, no stake, no power. I had not invested in my son's dream. I had gifted him my entire world, and he had given me a receipt that doubled as a leash. I thought back to that dinner. The laughter, the clinking glasses, David's reassuring hand on mine. Had he switched the pages? Had Marcus, his slick friend, drafted this monstrous document from the start, knowing I would be too blinded by motherly pride and grief to read every soul-crushing word? My trust had not been a foundation. It had been a loophole he had exploited with chilling precision. I was legally and financially erased. I was not a partner. I was a donation, and in the eyes of the law, I had absolutely no right to complain. The silence of the room was absolute, broken only by the frantic, useless beating of my own heart. I was trapped. The legal document was a closed door, locked and bolted from the other side. My fury, which had been a simmering pot, suddenly had nowhere to go. It turned inward, curdling into a thick, suffocating despair. The fight wasn't just against David anymore. It was against a version of myself I couldn't bear to face. The foolish, trusting mother who had signed away her life. For a few days, I faltered. The righteous anger that had propelled me forward was doused by a wave of profound, heartbreaking guilt. This was my son, my child, the boy I had held, whose fevers I had cooled, whose scraped knees I had bandaged. How could I plot the ruin of my own flesh and blood? One afternoon, when the house was empty and echoing with the ghosts of the family I thought I had, I found myself pulling a heavy, leather-bound photo album from the bottom of a storage box. I sat on the floor of my room, the stiff pages cracking as I opened them. And there he was. The first photo was of David at 5 years old. He was standing on a stool in our old kitchen, swallowed by one of Richard's white chef jackets, the sleeves rolled up a dozen times. A ridiculously large toque sat askew on his head, and he was beaming a toothy, gap-filled smile, his small hand gripping a wooden spoon alongside his father's much larger one. They were leaning over a steaming pot together, and Richard was looking down at him with an expression of such pure, unadulterated love that it stole my breath. I remembered that day. We were making his grandfather's bouillabaisse, a complicated, all-day affair. David had insisted on helping, and Richard, ever patient, had let him stir the roux, his small face screwed up in concentration. "He has the touch, Anna," Richard had whispered to me later that night. "He has the soul of a chef." I turned the page. David at 12. He was standing awkwardly in a stiff shirt and tie, holding a small silver trophy. He'd won a regional junior cooking competition. His smile was more restrained now, a little self-conscious, but his eyes were shining with pride. I was behind the camera, and Richard was standing just out of frame. I could still feel the electricity of that moment, the shared victory. Richard had been more proud than if he'd won the award himself. He saw his own passion reflected in his son, a continuation of a sacred line. Another page, a candid shot from a few years later. David was a teenager now, maybe 16, all lanky limbs and a defiant slouch. He was in the kitchen again, but this time he was arguing with Richard, gesturing with a knife at a piece of fish. I remembered the argument. It was about technique. David, fresh from a summer culinary program, was insisting on some new, trendy method of searing, while Richard was defending the classic, time-honored way. Their arguments were frequent then, clashes of tradition and ambition, but they were always underpinned by a deep, mutual respect. Or so I had thought. Looking at the photo now, I saw something else in David's eyes, something I had missed at the time. Not just youthful arrogance, but a flicker of resentment, a deep-seated impatience to escape his father's shadow. My fingers, thin and wrinkled, traced the outline of my son's face in the photograph, the boy with the gapped-toothed smile, the awkward pre-teen with the silver trophy, the intense young man desperate to prove himself. Could I truly be the architect of his downfall? The guilt was a physical weight, pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. I was at war with myself. The mother in me screamed in protest, her hands shielding the memory of that little boy in the oversized jacket. But the woman who had been discarded, whose husband's legacy had been plundered, demanded justice. Who was I supposed to be? The forgiving mother, enabling his cruelty with my silence? Or the avenging widow, honoring the man whose love and labor had been stolen and repackaged as a cheap commodity? The photos offered no answers. They only deepened the wound, showing me the boy I had lost and the monster he had become, forcing me to admit they were one and the same. My paralysis lasted for what felt like an eternity, but was likely only a few days. The legal defeat and the emotional turmoil had left me adrift. But desperation is its own kind of fuel. There had to be another way. I had to find my original copy of the agreement. It was a fool's hope, I knew. Even if I found it, it would be my word against theirs, a faded memory against a notarized document. Still, I had to try. It was the only tangible thing I could do. This new, fragile purpose sent me back to the storage boxes stacked in a corner of my room, a sad little monument to a life that no longer existed. I began to sift through them, not with any real hope, but with the grim determination of someone with nothing left to lose. I went through boxes of old clothes that smelled of cedar and disuse, boxes of books I'd already read, boxes of kitchen gadgets I was no longer allowed to use. Finally, I came to the last one, sealed with yellowing tape. On the side, in my own handwriting, were 2 words: Richard, private. My heart gave a painful lurch. This was his box. The things he had kept, the pieces of himself he hadn't wanted to throw away. I slit the tape with a nail file, the sound ripping through the quiet room. A faint, familiar scent rose to meet me: old paper, a hint of dried rosemary, and the unique, clean smell that had simply been him. Inside, things were neatly packed. A stack of old menus from restaurants we had loved, their corners soft with age. A bundle of letters I had written to him when he was working a brief stint in another city, tied with a blue ribbon. A handful of medals from his early culinary competitions, heavy and cool to the touch. And beneath it all, a stack of index cards covered in his familiar, elegant script, the first drafts of the very recipes David now claimed as his own. Seeing them felt like a punch to the gut. I set the cards aside, my hands shaking with a fresh wave of sorrow and anger. And that's when I saw it. Tucked at the very bottom of the box was a simple, dark green, leather-bound book, a journal. I had never known he kept one. Richard was not a man of effusive words. He expressed himself through food, through action, through the steady, quiet rhythm of his love for me. I hesitated. This felt like a profound violation, a trespass into the last private space of the man I loved. But the house was silent, my life was in ruins, and I was searching for an answer to a question I could barely articulate. How did we get here? How did the boy in the photo become the man who would discard his own mother? With trembling fingers, I lifted the journal from the box and opened it to a random page. His handwriting was as precise on the page as it was with a knife. The entry was dated about 10 years ago, back when David was in culinary school, brimming with new knowledge and a simmering resentment. October 14th, it read. David was home for the weekend. We argued again. He calls my methods archaic, peasant food. He says the future is in foams and deconstruction, not soul. I tried to explain that technique is nothing without soul, but he doesn't listen. He looks at me with such impatience. His jealousy is a sickness. He wants my reputation without my years of work. He wants the crown without the fight. My blood ran cold. I had known they'd had their disagreements, but I'd always seen it as a professional friction, the natural tension between generations. I never imagined Richard saw it as a sickness. I felt a knot of ice form in my stomach. With a sense of dread so powerful it was almost nauseating, I turned the page. The next entry was dated a week later. I knew that date. It was seared into my memory. It was the day of the accident. The day everything changed. October 21st, he wrote. The handwriting was different here, jagged, shaky, a testament to the pain he must have been in. My hand. God, my hand. The doctor says the nerve damage is severe. He talks about recovery, but I see it in his eyes. It's over. The pan of boiling oil. It happened so fast. David was behind me, reaching for something on the shelf above the stove. He stumbled. That's what he said. He stumbled into me. A clumsy accident. But I saw his eyes, Anna, just for a second, as the pan was tipping. There was no surprise in them. No panic. There was calculation. It was no accident. The journal slipped from my fingers and fell to the floor with a soft thud. The room tilted. The air became thick, unbreathable. It wasn't just a burn. It wasn't just an accident that had stolen my husband's career, that had broken his spirit and set him on a slow, painful decline that ended with his death. It was an attack, a deliberate act of violence. David hadn't just stolen a legacy. He had crippled its creator to clear his own path. He had seen his own father not as a mentor, but as an obstacle to be removed. The boy in the photographs, the man whose cruelty I had been agonizing over, was not just a thief and a liar. He was a monster. In that horrifying, clarifying instant, every shred of my hesitation, every ounce of my motherly guilt, vanished. It didn't just fade away. It was burned to ash by the white-hot revelation. What replaced it was not the fiery, chaotic anger I had felt before. This was something new, something cold, sharp, and perfectly clear. It was the glacial rage of absolute certainty. The war had a new name. This was no longer about money or recipes. This was about retribution. The ghost of a father had just handed me a sword, and I was going to use it. The rage had settled. For days after I read Richard's journal, a storm had howled inside me, a tempest of grief and fury so profound, I thought it would tear my physical body apart. I'd wept until my eyes were swollen slits, and my throat was raw. I had paced the suffocating confines of my windowless room until the cheap carpet wore a track. But storms pass. And what is left in their wake is a terrifying, crystalline calm. The landscape is scoured clean, the air is cold and sharp, and every detail stands out with unnerving clarity. The grief was still there, a permanent bedrock beneath my feet, but the howling fury had cooled and hardened into something far more dangerous: purpose. There were no more tears left to cry. There was only the plan. And the first step of the plan was to disappear. Not by leaving, but by becoming so utterly, pathetically present that I would become invisible. I began that very evening. David and Chloe were sprawled on their enormous white leather sofa, their faces illuminated by the blue glow of their phones. The television, a screen the size of a small car, was blaring some reality show about wealthy people arguing on a yacht. The sound was a meaningless drone, a backdrop to their silent, digital communion. I shuffled into the living room, my posture deliberately stooped, my feet dragging in the worn-out slippers they had given me. "David, dear," I began, my voice a quavering, uncertain thing. "I can't seem to find the remote for the television. I thought I'd watch a little of my program before bed." David didn't look up from his phone. "It's on the coffee table, Mom. It's always on the coffee table." His tone was flat, bored, the same tone one uses to answer a child's fifth straight question about why the sky is blue. "Oh, is it?" "I looked there. I really did," I said, making a show of peering at the glass surface, my hand fluttering near my face as if my eyesight were failing. "My eyes aren't what they used to be, you know." Chloe sighed, a theatrical, put-upon sound. She finally looked up, her perfectly sculpted eyebrows knitting together in annoyance. "Anna, it's right there, next to the stack of magazines." "Oh, silly me," I chirped, shuffling forward and fumbling for it. My hand accidentally knocked over a tall, empty glass of water David had left there. It didn't spill much, just a few drops, but the clatter it made on the glass table was satisfyingly sharp. "For God's sake, Mom!" David snapped, finally tearing his eyes from his screen. "Can you be careful? This is Italian marble." It wasn't. It was a cheap composite, but his pretension was a reliable trigger. "I'm so sorry, dear. I'm all thumbs today," I mumbled, dabbing at the non-existent puddle with the sleeve of my cardigan. I saw the look they exchanged over my bent head. It was a look of shared burden, of mutual pity for their unfortunate situation of having to house a decaying, inconvenient old woman. It was perfect. They didn't see a threat. They didn't see a mind colder and clearer than it had been in years. They saw a nuisance, a piece of furniture that had started to malfunction. And a nuisance is something you learn to ignore. My campaign of calculated incompetence escalated over the next few weeks. It became my art form. I developed a tremor in my hands that only appeared when I was holding something breakable, like the cheap, chipped plates I was designated to use. I would forget to add fabric softener to the laundry, but only for David's chef whites, leaving them stiff and scratchy for his long shifts. He would complain, Chloe would scold me like a child, and I would offer a performance of tearful, senile apology that deserved an award of its own. The true masterpiece came on a Tuesday. Chloe was dressed in a crisp, cream-colored pantsuit, her hair pulled back in a severe, professional style. She was tapping her foot impatiently by the door, her ludicrously expensive handbag perched on the edge of the kitchen counter. "I'm going to be late for the presentation with the new investors, David," she called out, her voice tight with stress. The traffic is already a nightmare. Coming? David's voice echoed from upstairs. This was my cue. I was carrying a large, freshly brewed pitcher of iced tea from the kitchen. My steps were slow, shuffling. As Chloe turned to check her makeup in the hall mirror, I executed a flawless, gentle stumble. It wasn't a fall, just a lurch. Enough to send the entire pitcher of dark, sugary tea arcing through the air. It landed with a spectacular splash all over the pristine white marble floor, and most beautifully, all over the bottom half of Chloe's cream-colored pantsuit. The silence that followed was electric. Chloe stared down at the spreading brown stain, her mouth a perfect O of disbelief. Her face, a mask of carefully applied foundation and ambition, seemed to crack. "Anna!" she shrieked, the sound high and piercing. "What did you do?" I dropped the pitcher, which clattered harmlessly on the floor, and brought my hands to my mouth in a display of theatrical horror. "Oh my goodness. Chloe, I am so sorry. My foot, it just slipped. Oh, your beautiful suit." David came thundering down the stairs. He took in the scene, the puddle of tea, my feigned distress, and his wife's face, which was contorting with a rage so pure it was almost beautiful. "Mom, what the hell?" he said, his voice low and dangerous. He wasn't looking at me with anger anymore. He was looking at me with a sort of weary disgust. He saw a problem that was getting worse, a liability. "Clean it up," he said, not to me, but as a general order to the universe. He put an arm around Chloe, steering her back towards the stairs. "Go change, honey. I'll handle this. We'll be late, but we'll make it." As Chloe shot me a look of pure venom before disappearing up the stairs, I was already on my hands and knees, dabbing at the sticky mess with cheap paper towels. My back ached, my knees protested against the hard floor, and the sickly sweet smell of the tea filled my nostrils. But inside, I was smiling. They were blind. They were so consumed with their own ascent that they never thought to look down at the woman they were stepping on. They didn't realize that their nuisance was a predator, gathering strength in the shadows they themselves had cast. Every sigh of their frustration, every roll of their eyes, every dismissive comment was a brick in the wall of my camouflage. Behind it, I was sharpening my claws. With my persona as a frail, doddering burden firmly established, the second phase of my plan could begin. My movements were no longer scrutinized. An old woman going for a walk to get some air was not a cause for suspicion. A walk to a shabby strip mall a few miles away, where I paid cash for a disposable burner phone and a prepaid data card. The young man behind the counter, with tattoos covering his neck, didn't even give me a second glance. I was just another grandma, probably buying a simple phone to call her grandkids. He had no idea I was purchasing a weapon. Back in my room, the door shut against the sounds of their lives, I unwrapped the cheap plastic. The screen glowed to life, stark and impersonal. This was not the phone David had given me, the one I suspected he occasionally checked. This one was a ghost. It was untraceable, anonymous. It was my key. Using the prepaid data, I spent hours hunched over the small screen, my reading glasses perched on my nose. I followed online tutorials, my fingers, which they saw as clumsy and arthritic, moving with surprising speed and precision across the tiny keyboard. I learned about virtual private networks, about routing my digital presence through servers in Sweden, in Singapore, in Brazil. To any prying eyes, the user of this phone would be a phantom, a whisper on the internet, existing everywhere and nowhere at once. My heart hammered against my ribs as I navigated to the Elysian Bites reservation website. It was a slick, ostentatious portal full of professionally shot photos of my husband's food, presented as David's creations. Bile rose in my throat, but I swallowed it down. This was not the time for emotion. This was the time for execution. I scrolled through the calendar. I knew from a stray comment David had made to Chloe when they thought I was napping that the judges for the prestigious Golden Fork Award were making their final anonymous visit sometime in the next 2 weeks. He was frantic, obsessed, drilling his staff with a manic intensity. They could come any night, he had said, his voice laced with a cocktail of terror and ambition. It has to be perfect. Every single night has to be perfect. I selected a date, the following Friday. Prime time. A table for one. The system asked for a name. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. Anna Sterling was a ghost of a different sort, a name associated with a forgotten past. I needed a new one. A name with weight, but no history. Esther Price. I typed it in. Esther was my mother's middle name, a woman of quiet, unshakable strength. And Price, well, a price was about to be paid. I confirmed the reservation. There it was, on the screen. Esther Price, Friday, 8:00 p.m. It felt like signing a declaration of war. With the reservation secured, it was time to light the fuse. I put the burner phone aside and picked up my own, the one they knew. I opened the encrypted messaging app I used for my secret life. My finger traced over the icon, and for a moment, the transformation was complete. I wasn't Anna, the grieving widow in a windowless room. I was Veritas Plate. In the world of cuisine, my anonymous account was a force of nature. I had spent years, even before Richard's death, cultivating it. I started it as a tribute to him, a way to champion the honest, soulful cooking we both loved and to call out the pretenders. I never showed my face. I never used my name. My currency was my palate, my knowledge, and my uncompromising honesty. A glowing review from Veritas Plate could turn a struggling bistro into an overnight sensation. A critical one could shutter the doors of an overhyped, overpriced establishment. I had over 1 million followers, a legion of food lovers, chefs, and critics who hung on my every word. David, in his arrogance, followed me obsessively, desperate for my validation. Never once suspecting the truth, was sleeping under his own roof. I scrolled through my contacts to a name, Liam. He was a young, hungry reporter for a major online publication. I'd discovered him a year ago, writing sharp, insightful pieces that were buried in the back pages of the site. I saw the talent, the same passion for truth that Richard had. Anonymously, as Veritas Plate, I had started mentoring him, sending him tips, critiquing his work, pushing him to be better. He didn't know who I was, only that the most powerful food critic online believed in him. He was loyal, and he was ready. I typed out the message, each word chosen with the precision of a surgeon. Liam, major story brewing at Elysian Bites, the night of the Golden Fork judging. I paused, letting the bait hang. Then I added the hook. The owner's past is about to be served up on a platter. Be there, be discreet, and be ready to write the story of your career. I attached a file. It was a single high-resolution scan of one of Richard's handwritten recipe cards from the old journal, the one for the lavender-infused crème brûlée. David's signature dessert. My finger hovered over the send button. This was the point of no return. Once Liam had this, the story was in motion, an avalanche I could no longer stop. I thought of Richard, of the smell of burnt oil and the sight of his bandaged hands. I thought of my $500,000 gift. I thought of my son telling a live stream audience his genius came from the notebook of a distant relative. The last of my hesitation evaporated, replaced by a cold, hard certainty. I pressed send. The message disappeared into the ether. The first domino had fallen. Now, I just needed to prepare for the final act. I needed my armor. The final days leading up to Friday were a masterclass in duality. Outwardly, I was Anna, the picture of decline. I misplaced David's car keys just before he had to leave for the restaurant, creating a frantic 20-minute search that ended when I found them in the sugar bowl. "Oh dear," I'd said, my voice trembling with feigned confusion. I must have thought it was a lump of sugar. The look of utter, soul-deep exasperation on his face was my reward. He was so busy managing the nuisance, he was completely blind to the threat. Inwardly, in the silent hours of the night in my room, I was a general planning a campaign. My target was no longer just David, it was the entire edifice of lies he had built on my husband's grave. And for this battle, I could not go as Anna. Anna was a victim. Anna was weak. Anna was invisible. I needed to become the woman who had booked that table. I needed to become Veritas Plate. This required a physical transformation. It required armor, and armor costs money. David and Chloe kept me on a tight leash, giving me a paltry cash allowance for incidentals that barely covered a bus fare. But my husband was a man who believed in preparing for rainy days. Years ago, long before Elysian Bites was even a glimmer in David's eye, Richard had taped a thick envelope to the underside of an old, dusty suitcase in the back of our storage unit. "For a real emergency, Annie," he'd said with a wink. The kind of emergency where you need to disappear or start a new life. I had never touched it. That week, feigning a trip to a doctor's appointment, I took a bus to the storage facility. The air in the unit was stale, thick with the ghosts of a life that was no longer mine. I found the suitcase, and my fingers closed around the envelope. It was still there. Inside were several $1,000s in crisp $100 bills. A final gift from the man whose memory I was about to avenge. My shopping trip was a targeted strike. I didn't go to the familiar, comfortable department stores of my past. I went to a chic, minimalist boutique downtown, the kind of place Chloe would frequent. The sales assistants were sleek and predatory, their eyes sizing me up the moment I walked in, their dismissive smiles barely concealed. They saw an old woman in a drab cardigan and sensible shoes, hopelessly out of place. They didn't see the crisp bills tucked into my purse. I moved through the racks with a purpose that unnerved them. I wasn't browsing. I was procuring a uniform. I found it almost immediately. A tailored black dress, simple, severe, and exquisitely cut. The fabric was a heavy crepe that draped without clinging, powerful in its understatement. It was the kind of dress that didn't ask for attention. It commanded it. Next, a specialty shop I had found online. Here, I purchased the two most crucial pieces of the disguise. First, a wig. It wasn't the soft, grandmotherly helmet of hair one might expect. It was a sharp, modern bob, the color of moonlight, a brilliant silver white that was both elegant and severe. It was a statement. Then, the glasses. I tried on dozens before I found the perfect pair. They weren't reading glasses. They were minimalist frames, a stark black line of modern architecture for the face. They were designed not to help one see, but to change how one is seen. They created a barrier, a mask of intellectual authority. They would obscure the soft, pained eyes of Anna Sterling that David knew so well. The night of the reservation, the house was thick with tension. David was a caged animal, pacing the living room, barking orders into his phone at his sous chef. Chloe was trying to soothe him, her voice a low, placating murmur. They paid me no mind as I slipped into my room, carrying a small tray with a bowl of soup and a piece of bread, my dinner for the evening. "I'm feeling a bit tired, dears," I had told them. "I think I'll just have a quiet night in." "Good," David had muttered without looking at me. "Just stay out of the way tonight, Mom. Please." "Of course, dear," I'd replied, my voice gentle and submissive. Behind my closed door, I did not eat. I began the ritual. It was a transformation, a shedding of a skin. I laid the pieces of my armor out on the narrow bed, the black dress, the silver wig, the stark glasses. I showered, scrubbing away the scent of this house, of their lives, of my subjugation. I stood before the small, cheap mirror on the back of the door, and I began to assemble the new me. First, the dress. The heavy quality fabric felt alien and wonderful against my skin after years of wearing worn-out clothes. I zipped it up, and my posture changed instantly. I stood straighter, taller. This was not a dress for shuffling. This was a dress for striding. Then, the makeup. I had bought a few expensive items. A bold, dark red lipstick, a clean, sharp eyeliner. My hands were steady. The face that looked back at me was starting to become unfamiliar. The lines of grief and weariness were still there, but they were now framed by a new, deliberate severity. I picked up the wig. I tucked my own thinning, gray-brown hair under a cap. Then, I settled the silver bob onto my head. The change was shocking. The woman in the mirror was not Anna. She was someone else entirely. A stranger. She was sharp, modern, ageless, and intimidating. Her hair was a crown of silver ice. Finally, I slid on the glasses, and there she was. The transformation was complete. The soft, tired eyes were gone, replaced by a cool, analytical gaze behind a veneer of designer glass. I looked at my reflection, And for the first time in a very long time, I did not see a victim. I did not see David's inconvenient mother or Richard's grieving widow. I saw power. I saw control. I saw a woman who could burn an empire to the ground and not shed a single tear. I was no longer Anna. I was Veritas Plate. And I was going to war. The heavy glass door of Elysian Bites swung open with a silent, expensive sigh. A wave of carefully curated air, smelling faintly of citrus and roasted herbs, washed over me. It was the scent of manufactured success, of money poured into image. I smoothed the lapels of my silk blazer, a deep emerald green that felt like armor. The wig, a chic silver bob, was expertly fitted, and the large fashionable glasses hid the familiar contours of my face. I was not Anna Sterling, the forgotten mother. I was Veritas Plate, an entity, a myth made flesh. The young host at the podium gave me a practiced, impersonal smile. His eyes scanned my designer outfit, my confident posture, and landed on the reservation name on his tablet. Veritas Plate, he murmured, his professional mask flickering with a hint of genuine awe. Of course, right this way, madam. He led me through the dining room, a symphony of hushed conversations, the delicate clink of silverware on porcelain, and the soft glow of bespoke lighting that made everyone look like a movie star. I saw them immediately, David and Chloe, hovering over a table of 4 stern-faced individuals, the Golden Fork judges. My son was a portrait of charm and ambition, his smile wide, his gestures expansive. Chloe, clinging to his arm, was a vision in white, her laughter a little too loud, a little too sharp. She was playing the part of the devoted wife, the muse to a genius. The lie was so polished it almost gleamed. David's eyes swept the room, a king surveying his domain. They passed over me for a fraction of a second. There was no flicker of recognition, not even a hint of curiosity. I was just another solitary diner, an elderly woman in expensive clothes occupying a foretop that could have generated more revenue. A flicker of annoyance crossed his face before he turned his brilliant smile back to the judges. That single, dismissive glance was all the fuel I needed. It burned away the last vestiges of a mother's lingering softness and left only cold, hard purpose. "Will this table be to your liking, madam?" the host asked, gesturing to a prime spot with a panoramic view of the dining room and the stage-lit open kitchen. "It's perfect," I said, my voice a calm, low alto that was not quite my own. It was the voice I used for my narrations, a voice of authority. He seated me, and I settled into the plush velvet chair, my back straight. I placed my purse on the seat beside me. Inside, nestled next to my wallet, was a small, laminated card, its edges yellowed with time and love. The waiter, a young man with a carefully rehearsed speech, presented the menu. I didn't need to look at it. I knew it by heart. I had bled for these recipes, wept for them, celebrated them with the man who had created them beside me. "I'll have the 5-course tasting menu," I stated, my tone leaving no room for discussion. "And a bottle of the Sancerre." The waiter nodded and vanished. I took a moment, breathing in the atmosphere of my son's stolen kingdom. It was all built on a foundation of lies, a beautiful, fragile house of cards. And I was here to provide the gust of wind that would bring it all down. I reached into my purse, retrieved my phone, and propped it carefully against the flower vase. I logged into my private Instagram account, the one with hundreds of thousands of paying subscribers, chefs, critics, investors, and passionate foodies who hung on my every word. I hit the Go Live button. A small red icon pulsed in the corner of my screen. The viewer count began to climb instantly, 1, then 10, then 100, then 1,000. A small caption appeared at the bottom of the screen, typed with a single steady thumb. "Veritas Plate at Elysian Bites. Let's see if the hype is real." I knew Liam was watching. His finger would be poised over the publish button for the article that would shatter this illusion forever. I smiled, a small cold curve of my lips, and waited for the first course. The performance was about to begin. The first course arrived, placed before me with a flourish by the waiter: seared scallop with parsnip puree and a brown butter vinaigrette. It was Richard's Ode to the Sea, a dish we had perfected on a rainy Tuesday in our small home kitchen, laughing as we argued over the precise second the scallop should be lifted from the pan. I remembered the scent of the nutty brown butter, the earthy sweetness of the parsnips he'd insisted on buying from the farmer's market that morning. I lifted my fork, the camera on my phone capturing the movement. I took a small bite. The texture was the first betrayal. I let the food rest on my tongue, my expression unreadable. Then, I leaned slightly toward my phone, my voice a soft, intimate murmur for my audience alone. "The first course," I began, my voice clear and steady in the silent world of the live stream. "A seared scallop." I paused, letting the silence hang. "The scallop itself is cooked competently. The caramelization is even. The temperature is acceptable. It is the work of a cook who can follow instructions." Another pause. I took a sip of my wine, cleansing my palate. But the foundation, the soul of the dish, is flawed." I gestured with my fork toward the white swirl on the plate. "The parsnip puree it rests on is grainy. It speaks of a hurried blender, of a cook who doesn't have the patience to pass it through a tamis. My husband, Richard, the true author of this recipe, used to say that a puree should be like silk against the tongue. This is sand. It's a technical failure born from a lack of respect for the ingredient." I continued, my voice a relentless, surgical instrument. "And the vinaigrette. It's supposed to be a brown butter vinaigrette. I smell butter, yes, but not the deep, nutty, complex aroma of beurre noisette. This is simply melted butter, an amateur's shortcut. It coats the mouth in grease instead of lifting the dish with warmth." My viewers' comments were flying by in a blur of shock and agreement. "She's back. No holding back tonight. Destroy them." "What we have here," I concluded, pushing the plate slightly away from me, "is not a celebration of the ocean. It is a hollow echo of a dish that was meant to sing. The body is here, but the soul has been scooped out and discarded." The second course came. Braised short rib with a red wine reduction and celeriac fondant. Another of Richard's classics. He called it his apology dish because it was so rich and comforting, it could mend any argument. I remembered the smell of it filling our home for 8 hours, the deep, complex aroma of wine and herbs and slow-cooked love. I tasted it. My face remained a mask of calm concentration. "The short rib," I narrated to my unseen audience, my voice dropping even lower, drawing them in. "It falls apart under the fork, as it should. The braising time is correct, but the flavor, it's one-dimensional. The red wine reduction tastes of, well, it tastes of inexpensive wine. There's a harsh, acidic note on the back of the palate. A proper reduction of this kind should be a slow, patient process of coaxing out sugars and deep, dark fruit notes. This tastes like it was boiled down in 20 minutes with a stock cube. There is no depth, no love." I prodded the small, pale cube on the plate. "And the celeriac fondant. It should be tender, translucent, saturated with the flavor of the chicken stock it was cooked in. This is watery. It's under-seasoned. The stock they used was clearly commercial, full of salt but devoid of the collagen and gelatin that gives a real stock its body and soul. It's a ghost of what it should be." By the third course, the pan-roasted duck breast with a cherry gastrique, I had found my rhythm. I was no longer just a critic. I was a historian, a storyteller, correcting a flawed and plagiarized narrative. "The skin on the duck is not rendered properly," I said, pointing my knife at the thick layer of fat beneath the skin. "It's flabby, not crisp, a sign of a pan that wasn't hot enough or a chef in a rush. Richard would have spent 15 minutes on this skin alone, rendering it slowly until it was like a sheet of brittle glass." I tasted the sauce. The gastrique is cloying. It's overwhelmingly sweet, lacking the sharp, vinegary counterpoint that defines a true gastrique. It's a sauce for someone who thinks fine dining is just about making things taste like candy. It's an insult to the cherries and an insult to the duck. The room was beginning to notice. Diners at nearby tables were casting curious glances my way, seeing me speak softly but intensely to my phone. David, still schmoozing with the judges, shot another look in my direction, this one laced with clear irritation. A lone woman talking to her phone was a disruption to his perfectly orchestrated evening. He had no idea the disruption was an earthquake, and he was standing at the epicenter. For the fourth course, a risotto, I didn't hold back. "Truffle oil," I said with a quiet sigh, the sound amplified for my audience. The calling card of a chef who wants to project luxury without understanding it. It has the same acrid chemical smell of cheap perfume. This risotto is technically proficient. The rice is al dente, but it's soulless. It's a dish designed for Instagram, not for the palate. It is a lie in a bowl. I finally delivered the line that had been forming in my mind all evening, the thesis statement for my entire critique. I looked directly into the camera lens, my eyes cold and clear. "This is not cooking," I said, each word a carefully placed stone. "This is plagiarism." Plagiarism, executed by a C student who copied the master's notes but understood none of the poetry. The final course was being prepared. The lavender crème brûlée, Richard's masterpiece. The first dish he ever made for me. The dessert that sealed our love story. David, in a moment of supreme arrogance, chose to present this dish to the judge's table himself. A waiter followed him with a small blowtorch for the tableside theatrics. He approached their table with a flourish, his voice booming with false humility. "And for the finale," he announced, "my signature dessert, a lavender-infused crème brûlée, a little piece of my heart on a plate." He torched the sugar with practiced ease, the flame casting a dramatic glow on his proud face. The judges murmured their appreciation. As my own crème brûlée was placed before me by a different waiter, I knew the time had come. The setup was complete. The final act was mine to direct. I pushed my chair back, the sound scraping loudly in the suddenly quiet room. Every eye turned to me. I stood up, my movements calm and deliberate. I picked up my phone, the live stream still active, the viewer count now in the tens of thousands. Holding it like a torch, I began to walk. Not toward the exit, but toward the open kitchen, a direct path to my son. The low murmur of the restaurant died completely. There was only the sound of my heels clicking softly on the polished concrete floor. David was handing a spoon to one of the judges, his back to me. Chloe saw me first. Her painted smile froze, her eyes widening in confusion, then dawning horror as her brain processed the impossible. The silver wig, the expensive clothes, but the walk, the posture, it was undeniably her mother-in-law. "David," she whispered, her voice a strangled hiss. He turned, an annoyed expression on his face, ready to have security escort this disruptive old woman out. He saw me. His eyes met mine, and in that instant, the entire charade of his life shattered. The color drained from his face. The charming smile collapsed into a slack-jawed mask of pure, unadulterated terror. He saw not just an old woman in a wig, but the ghost of his father, the conscience he had buried, the truth he had tried to outrun. "Mother?" he stammered, his voice a pathetic, cracking whisper that was audible in the tomb-like silence. "What? What are you doing? Get back to your—" His words trailed off, useless and hollow. He knew. It was over. The silence in Elysian Bites was absolute, a thick, heavy blanket of shock. Every diner, every waiter, and most importantly, the 4 judges at the table beside us, stared, their faces a mixture of confusion and rapt attention. My son stood frozen, a deer caught in the headlights of an oncoming truth. His carefully constructed world was crumbling in real time, and all I had done was stand up and walk toward him. My voice, when I spoke, was not loud, but it cut through the silence like a shard of glass. It was the voice of Veritas Plate, clear, steady, and merciless. My phone was still held high, its camera capturing every detail for the thousands watching, for Liam, for the world. "This isn't your signature dessert, David," I said, my gaze locking onto his. I didn't need to gesture at the crème brûlée. My words were enough. I then turned my head slightly, just enough to include the horrified judges in my address. This was the last dish Richard Sterling, my husband, taught me. He perfected it right before an accident in the kitchen destroyed his hand and ended his career. I let the word accident hang in the air, freighted with years of unspoken suspicion. A collective gasp rippled through the room. Chloe looked like she might faint. David's face had gone from pale to a ghastly mottled gray. "You remember that accident, don't you, David?" I asked, my voice soft, yet carrying the weight of an accusation. I didn't wait for an answer. The panicked terror in his eyes was answer enough. With my free hand, I reached into my purse. My fingers closed around the cool, smooth surface of the laminated card. I pulled it out. It was a simple 4x6 recipe card, yellowed with age and speckled with faint, ghostly stains of vanilla and butter. But on it, in his bold, familiar scrawl, was my husband's handwriting, the recipe for his lavender crème brûlée. I held it up first to my phone's camera, ensuring my subscribers, my jury, saw the evidence clearly. The camera focused on the faded ink, the loving notes in the margin. "Add lavender sparingly. It's a whisper, not a shout," one note read. Then I turned the card and held it out for the room to see. For the judges, for David. It was an artifact from a past he had tried to erase, an undeniable token of his fraud. "He wrote this for me on our 10th anniversary," I said, my voice resonating with a truth so profound it silenced every other thought in the room. I finally looked away from the judges and back at my son, the son who had been born of love and had chosen greed. "The secret ingredient was never lavender, David." I delivered the final lines, the culmination of my pain, my love, and my vengeance. Each word was precise, cold, and utterly devastating. It was a husband's love for his wife, something this kitchen and its owner are utterly devoid of. The live feed on my phone exploded with a torrent of comments I couldn't read, a digital firestorm. I knew Liam's article, armed with my live stream as irrefutable proof, was already halfway written, ready to be unleashed upon the world. In the restaurant, there was nothing but a stunned, echoing silence. David just stood there, a hollowed-out man in a chef's jacket, his empire of lies reduced to ash at his feet. I had not raised my voice. I had not shed a tear. I had simply served him the truth. And it was a dish best served cold. My review, which I titled "Elysian Bites, A Graveyard of Stolen Dreams," wasn't just posted. It detonated. I had written it in the quiet hours after the confrontation, my hands steady, my mind a placid lake of cold fury. Each word was a stone dropped into that lake, the ripples destined to become a tidal wave. The moment I hit publish, the digital world ignited. It was a wildfire of clicks, shares, and comments, spreading faster than I could have ever imagined. My phone, which had been silent for so long in that guest room, began to vibrate incessantly, not with calls from my son, but with notifications from a world waking up to his deceit. Liam's exposé landed less than 12 hours later. It was a masterpiece of journalistic precision. He had taken the contents of Richard's journal, which I had delivered to his office in a plain manila envelope, and woven them into a narrative so damning it was impossible to ignore. He didn't just report on the stolen recipes. He told the story of the burn, of a young man's jealousy curdling into a single, life-altering act of violence. The accident was now laid bare as an ambition-fueled crime. The story was no longer about a bad review. It was about a foundation of lies, a house built on the ashes of a great man's career. The consequences were swift and merciless. The Golden Fork Committee issued a public statement, their language sterile and corporate, but the message was clear. The nomination for Elysian Bites was rescinded, effective immediately. They spoke of upholding integrity in the culinary arts, a phrase that felt like a bitter, private victory. Then came the investors. I pictured them in their boardrooms, staring at spreadsheets and damning headlines, their calculated risks turning into unmitigated disasters. The lawsuits were filed before the week was out, a torrent of legal jargon that all boiled down to one simple thing. They wanted their money back from the fraud who had charmed them. I didn't need to see the restaurant to know it was over. But one afternoon I drove by. The elegant, cursive sign was gone. The large glass windows that once showcased a bustling, exclusive world were now covered in cheap, brown paper, wrinkled and taped from the inside. It looked like a wound that had been crudely bandaged. A simple printed, "For Lease" sign was already staked into the manicured patch of grass out front. It was a tombstone. David and Chloe's empire, so meticulously constructed on ego and theft, had crumbled to dust in a matter of days. I watched from a distance as the moving trucks arrived at their house, my former prison. I saw them carrying out the designer furniture, the oversized art, the relics of a life they felt entitled to. I didn't feel triumph. I felt nothing. A profound and cleansing emptiness. They lost the house, the luxury cars that were always too clean, the carefully curated social standing. They lost the image they had worshipped above all else. They had become ghosts in their own lives, their names synonymous with scandal. I never spoke to them again. There were no final, tearful confrontations, no angry phone calls. I simply deleted David's number from my phone. The finality of that small act felt more significant than any shouted word. I walked away from the wreckage without a single backward glance, leaving the silence in the house to be filled by echoes of their false laughter and panicked arguments. The air itself felt lighter, as if the very molecules had been freed from the pressure of their pretense. The fame of Veritas Plate, once a shield, became a tool. My follower count had exploded, and with that came a new kind of power. I didn't want it for myself. I wanted to use it to honor Richard, to build something real from the ruins of what David had desecrated. I established the Richard Sterling Foundation. The process was cathartic. I sat with lawyers and financial advisors, not as a victim signing away her life savings, but as a founder, a director. I poured all the energy I had once used to survive into creating a legacy of truth. My anonymity as a critic remained my armor, but my purpose was now unapologetically public. The foundation's mission was simple: to find and fund talented, honest young chefs. The ones who cooked from the heart, who respected their ingredients, who understood that a recipe is a story, not just a set of instructions. I traded a life of servitude in my son's house for a life of service to my husband's memory. I was no longer the ghost in the guest room. I was the unseen force helping new dreams take flight. I live downtown now. My loft is an open, airy space, with floor-to-ceiling windows that flood the rooms with a warm, buttery light. It's the kind of sunlight that feels like a promise. After years in a room without a single window, I sometimes just stand in the middle of the living room and let it wash over me, a physical baptism. I have my own test kitchen. It's not enormous or ostentatious, but it's mine. Stainless steel gleams, a small rack of fresh herbs grows by the window, and my husband's worn, beloved cast-iron skillet sits proudly on the stove. I don't cook complicated, deconstructed fantasies anymore. My hands find their rhythm in simple, comforting food. A rich tomato soup, a crusty loaf of bread, a slow-braised stew. Today, I'm stirring a pot of chicken noodle soup, the aroma filling my kitchen, a scent of pure, uncomplicated care. I prop my phone on a small tripod, the red light blinking, recording for my TikTok. The camera doesn't see an old, forgotten woman. It sees Veritas Plate, yes, but it also sees Anna, finally at peace. I look directly into the lens, a small, genuine smile on my face. As I ladle the golden broth into a simple ceramic bowl, my voiceover begins, the tone calm, clear, and absolute. They took my home, leaving me in a room without light. They took my money, the last gift from my husband, and called it a present to themselves. They took my husband's legacy, twisting his love into a commodity. So I took the only thing they ever truly valued. I took their image. I pause, letting the steam from the soup rise like a fleeting spirit. Some say revenge is a dish best served cold. I disagree. It's best served to a global audience, with a side of inescapable truth.